Hi, thanks for attending GopherCon, and thanks for attending my talk, A Rainbow of Gophers, Building a More Diverse Community. My name is Kris Brandow. Now, before we get into the talk, I want to give you a little bit of information about who I am and my background. I'm currently a senior software engineer at Wonderkind. I've been a professional software engineer for 9 years now. Of that 9 years, I've spent 7 of it writing Go full-time. And you can find me basically anywhere on the internet at Scriptable. And a fun fact about me is that I am a writer. I absolutely love writing, and I actually have a creative writing degree, and I've always wanted to be an author. Now, before we get into the content of the talk, I want to start us off with an outline of what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to start with an introduction. This includes what this talk is actually about, why I'm giving it at GopherCon, and some context to help you understand the content of this talk a little better. Next, we're going to set the stage. This is the first big part of the talk, and in it, we're going to go over some key definitions to understanding the space I'm talking about, some of my own personal background and why I'm personally giving this talk, and the reach that I see diversity can actually have. And then finally, in the second part of this talk, I'm going to give some building blocks that can help us build a more diverse and inclusive community. These include 3 specific blocks. The first one is impact versus intent. Next is about identity development. And lastly, we're going to talk about continually staying curious. Finally, I'll have a nice little conclusion and summary to wrap things up. So, with that, let's get started. So, what is this talk about? Well, you've probably guessed from the title that this is a talk about diversity inclusion, but diversity inclusion is a really large space. So it helps if we start off with how we define diversity and inclusion when we're saying those words in this talk specifically. So let's start with diversity. Diversity is the state of having a large variety of backgrounds and ideas. Diversity is a property of an organization or a community, not necessarily of the individuals within that organization or community. It has intensity, so it's better to think of diversity as something that is more or less instead of something that a community has or doesn't have. Now, since diversity is just a property, there needs to be something that actually drives it, that can give you more or less diversity within a community. And that driver is inclusion. Now, inclusion is really about making it so people that have different backgrounds and ideas feel they can participate within the community organization. And sometimes it goes even a bit further than that. It can also mean that people that have different ideas and backgrounds feel that they can present or have those ideas and backgrounds included in conversations and the topics that that community or organization covers. Now, I want to make an important point here, that having more diversity and having more inclusion can actually help us build better software. We know this because we know that having more diversity within a space leads to easier problem solving and higher quality products. And when you're a community that produces something, you are at the end of the day producing a product. Now, why is this talk at GopherCon? I've been a member of several different software engineering communities over the course of my career, and the Go community stands out as a particularly incredible one. It's welcoming, warm, it accepts people of all different kinds of backgrounds. It even has space for people that have different ideas to all still feel like they're part of the same community. However, if you watched Johnny Bursico's closing keynote last year, you'll know that our community has a ways to go when it comes to some very notable ways that we can be more diverse. In his talk, he went around GopherCon trying to find all of the black engineers he could, and he really only found a handful. So while this community is incredible, we still have a lot of work to do in growing it to be a more diverse and more inclusive community. Now, I've purposely structured this talk as building blocks to help you have something tangible you can use every day to help drive a more inclusive community that will result in a higher amount of diversity. I want to note that this isn't a history lesson. We're not going to go into the history of diversity and inclusion, and I'm certainly not trying to suggest that these 3 things I'm going to give you today are going to be enough to solve diversity and inclusion problems as a whole. This is a long journey and an incredibly complex problem. And these are just a few simple starting tools to help us build toward that more diverse and inclusive community. Now, a lot of the time, these talks are structured for, say, people that are in leadership, senior management, the C-suite of companies. At least that's been my experience with a lot of diversity and inclusion content. However, this talk is specifically structured for anyone in the community. So it definitely should be helpful for those that are in positions of power and leadership and management, like those in the C-suite. But it should also be helpful for people that are just starting out. Whether this is your first day in the Go community, or you're a junior engineer or an intern, or you've been around for a decade. The content of this talk should help us build a more diverse and inclusive community. And really, the advice I'm going to give today isn't just for the Go community. It can be useful in your job at work. It can be useful in other communities you might be a part of. And I also want to point out that diversity and inclusion isn't just something that benefits marginalized people. It does benefit marginalized people, but it also benefits everybody else. Because in reality, we're all different from each other, even though sometimes we like to group and bucket ourselves. Now I'd like to set some context for the information in this talk. So first off, this talk is based on a lot of my own lived personal experience, matched with a lot of deep conversations I've had with friends, family, coworkers, and members of the community, and a bit of research. A lot of the content of this talk is founded in this book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And I'll be referencing this book throughout the talk. And finally, a lot of the examples in this talk will use race as their primary driver. This doesn't mean that the information in this talk is only applicable to race. It's applicable much wider. But race is something I have a personal connection to, and I think for a lot of people, it's an easier thing to understand than some other forms of diversity and inclusion. With that, let's move on to setting the stage. We'll start with definitions. Now, I already gave a quick definition of diversity, but let's put it here more formally. Diversity is possessing a variety of backgrounds and ideas. And that's driven by inclusion. And inclusion is the actions, behaviors, and norms that enable diversity. Having a more inclusive environment or a more inclusive community means that we can have a more diverse community. And having a less inclusive community means that we'll wind up having a less diverse community. Next, I want to talk about marginalized. I've used this word a couple of times already, and in this talk, marginalized means groups who have historically had less systemic power. This is a somewhat comparative term. Usually you need to have at least 2 groups to have one of them be marginalized. A group in and of itself is usually not marginalized. And really what this means is that an individual who is a member of a marginalized group has less systemic power than they would have if they were not a member of that group. Now, I used the word systemic a couple of times, and we'll get to that definition in a minute, but first I want to talk about systemic oppression. Now, systemic oppression is oppression caused by a system of power. Now, you can think of systems of power as things like corporations, governments, and in some cases, even communities. Some examples of systemic oppression include racism, sexism, heterosexism, and ableism. Now, throughout this talk, I'll be using the term heterosexism instead of the somewhat more popular term homophobia, because heterosexism is a little more accurate. but feel free to use them interchangeably. They do mean slightly different things, but most of the time people understand what you're trying to talk about. Now, I've used the word systemic a lot, and I said I'd define it for you, but there is also another word that's incredibly similar to systemic, and that's systematic. And it's helpful to define systemic in contrast to systematic. You can think of systemic as unintentional and systematic as intentional, but that lacks a lot of nuance. Systemic means of the system, whereas systematic means a method or a specific way of executing an action. So you can also think of systemic versus systematic as small versus large, respectively. Here's an easy example to go with. When you have systemic racism in an organization, you might not have any individual person that is actually attempting to advantage or disadvantage someone based on their race. Whereas if you have systematic racism, you have people that are intentionally trying to advantage or disadvantage individuals based on their race. For example, an entire company can have an issue with systemic racism where they aren't promoting black people. Whereas if you have a company that has systematic racism, there might be an individual manager who screens through resumes and looks people up on LinkedIn to see what race they are, and then chooses to only interview white candidates. Next, I want to define these 4 terms: racism, sexism, heterosexism, and ableism. And these are systems of perceived advantage based on traits. Now, this definition might contradict with what you've come to believe of what these terms mean. People often think of these terms as prejudice based on a trait or quality. However, in this talk, we won't be using that definition for these terms. Importantly as well, when we use the terms racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, we're not talking about systems that intend disadvantage. We're talking specifically about systems that intend an advantage for a group of people, respectively, white people, men, heterosexual straight people, and able-bodied people. Now, the result of this advantage can be disadvantage for groups. For example, in the case of sexism, it can be disadvantages for women. In the case of heterosexism, it can be disadvantages for queer or gay people. For ableism, it can be disadvantages for people that are neurologically diverse or have a physical disability. However, those are generally secondary traits. They're knock-on qualities of the system. Fundamentally, these systems are created and exist to provide specific people and specific groups with advantages. And with that, I'd like to get a little bit into my own personal background and why I'm giving this talk. So first off, I'm actually a member of 2 different marginalized groups, one that is visible and one that is non-visible. I've studied this topic and related areas throughout college and throughout my professional career. I've spent countless hours in deep discussion with both people just like myself who don't do this professionally, but also with professionals who work within the diversity and inclusion space. And from all of that, I've developed my own hypotheses and theories around diversity and inclusion, and that I've actually attempted to implement them and observe the results. The content of this talk is actually an outcome of those results. And before we move on to the building blocks, I just want to talk a little bit about the reach of diversity. Now, as I said, if we can have a community that has more inclusion, that drives more diversity. And having more diversity within a community, well, that can lead to a lot of good things. It's not only a moral good, but it also leads to better software overall. That means finding and resolving more bugs or writing software that doesn't have as many bugs to begin with, but it also means writing software that we might not have even known we needed to write in the first place. Now, having more software and having software that has fewer bugs drives up usage of that software. If we can provide the libraries and applications that people need, then they'll continue to use what we provide. More usage drives higher adoption, both in general and within companies and organizations, and especially within organizations, that can drive more hiring of people with, say, Go skills. Now, that larger amount of hiring means more opportunities for Gophers. And the more opportunities we have, the more appealing our community is overall to people that have more diverse backgrounds. And, interestingly, to close the loop, having more diversity will lead to having more inclusion overall. And that starts the cycle all over again. So really, diversity has a very, very wide reach, and that reach is powered by inclusion. Now, 2 notes before we get into the building blocks. First, I want to make the point that groups are not equal to individuals, and individuals are not equal to groups. While sometimes we can draw conclusions about a group or individual based on the other, by and large, these should be thought of as separate entities. And secondly, perceived is not unnecessarily always the actual. Earlier when I gave the definition for racism, sexism, heterosexism, and ableism, I said that they're systems of perceived advantage based on traits. That perceived is important. That's because while an advantage might be for an individual, it might be a disadvantage overall. I'll give an example. So we know from some general research that men who communicate with an authoritative, loud, and commanding style are often seen as leadership material and put into positions of power, whereas women who display the same qualities and traits are seen as bossy, and those same qualities are a negative for them. This can be seen as a perceived advantage for men, because it gives them an advantage in the way that we want our leadership to act for men. However, we also know that it's extremely important for team cohesion to have psychological safety. And we know that loud and commanding and forceful leadership styles don't usually result in psychological safety. Which means that while it is an advantage for men to communicate in this way, it's a disadvantage for all of us overall to have people that communicate in these ways be in positions of power and leadership. And with that, let's move on to the first building block. Impact versus intent. Now, I like to think about this as where you start when you don't know where to start. Let's start off with some basic definitions as we have throughout this talk. Intent. Intent is what did you want to happen? What did you mean to happen? To use a little recursive definition, what did you intend to happen? This could be something like, you intend to write code with very few bugs. Or, you intend to communicate with people within the community in a respectful manner. Impact. Impact is what actually happened. These are the actions and outcomes that are driven by our actions with which we had intent. For example, you intended to write code with very few bugs, but the impact, the outcome, is that you actually wrote code with a lot of bugs. Also, your intent could be that you wanted to communicate with someone in the community respectfully, but the impact is that you wound up communicating with someone in the community in a rather disrespectful manner. Now, intent needs to be positive. It has to be greater than 0. And in this talk, I'll be assuming that your intent, and the intent when you're using these blocks, building blocks, is positive. Now, we already have some systems in place to deal with negative intent, such as our code of conduct, so we won't be discussing that today. So when we talk about intent versus impact, we want to make sure that the equation looks a little bit like this. We want our intent to be greater than 0, and we want our impact to be greater than or equal to our intent. Using our running examples, that means that if we intend to write 10 or fewer bugs, That's a positive intent. And then our impact is that we wrote 5 bugs in our code. Then we've satisfied this equation. Our intent is greater than 0, and our impact is greater than our intent. The same can be said if we want to communicate with someone in a respectful way, and when we ask them, we have in fact communicated with them in a respectful way. However, all too often, the impact versus intent equation winds up looking like this. Our intent was greater than 0, but our impact was less than 0. So, positive intent, negative impact. We might encounter something like this in, say, some of the strategies we use to write code. Some of those strategies are founded in the idea that we'll write bug-free code, or code with relatively few bugs, but the impact of those strategies winds up being that we write tons of bugs into our code. It doesn't mean that those strategies are bad, it just means that that's an opportunity for us to go back, reevaluate why the impact didn't match the intent we had. To solidify this sum, I want to give us an example to work with. This is what I like to call the school dance example. It's adapted from Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? Now, we start our story with a black student and a white teacher in a classroom. The white teacher has inquired with the black student if the black student is going to attend the upcoming school dance. The black student, like most of the black students at this particular school, aren't from the neighborhood. They're bussed in from a neighboring neighborhood. And therefore, most of the black students don't engage in extracurricular activities, and they don't go to things like the school dance. The black student politely declines and says, "No, I'm not planning on going to the school dance." The white teacher attempts to convince the student to go to the dance, and the student continues to say that she will not. And finally, at the end of the conversation, the white teacher says, "Oh, come on, I know you people love to dance." The black student is rather upset by this and feels quite offended and leaves the classroom. She makes her way to the cafeteria, but on the way she runs into one of her white friends. This friend can see that she's upset and distressed by something and inquires about what is going on. The black student recounts the story of what has just happened to her, and the white student says to her, "Oh, come on. He's a nice guy. He didn't mean it that way. You're being oversensitive." The black student is now even more distraught, ends that conversation, and continues her way to the cafeteria. When she gets to the cafeteria, she sees a table that is filled mostly with black students, of which many are her friends. She sits down with them, and the friends can tell she's quite upset by something, and they also inquire why. However, this time, when she recounts the story, one of the other kids at the table says, "You know what? He said the exact same thing to me yesterday." And there's an entire conversation that validates the black student's experience. Now, in this story, all 3 parties had positive intent. The teacher wanted to see the black student engaging with her fellow students. The friend, the white friend, wanted to cheer up or help the friend feel better. And the kids at the black table, well, they just wanted to provide a community for the black student. However, in the first 2 instances, the impact of those actions was negative. In the first instance, the impact was, well, racially insensitive. And in the second, it was invalidating of lived experience. Now, first I want to say that impact is defined by those who are impacted, which means in this case, the impact is solely defined by the black student. And conversely, intent is defined by those who intended. So in this case, the intent is defined by the white teacher, the white friend, and the black kids at the table. Now, before I get into the concrete things that we can do to change these conversations so that they can be a little less harmful impact-wise, I want to say that the goal here is to aim for better. We don't need perfect. Don't try and come up with the perfect way to communicate with people. And ultimately, understand that we will all make mistakes. We will all get this wrong. There are all times when we have negative impact on people when we intend to have a positive one on them. So, using the example I just laid out, let's go over the mini blocks that construct this larger block of intent versus impact. So, first off, having a negative impact doesn't make you a bad person. The white teacher and the white friend in this example aren't necessarily bad people. Their intentions were good. Their intentions were to try and help someone. Next, when you do have a negative impact, there's a really quick cycle that we have. It's called apologize, learn, and move on. In the first step, you apologize for having a negative impact. If you are in a space where you can actually reflect, you perhaps dive into why you end up having a negative impact, and then you move on. As a simple example, within the trans community, when someone is misgendered, this is the cycle that people often want to go through. If you misgender someone, you say, I'm sorry, and the conversation moves on. And maybe if you want to understand a little bit more, you can inquire a little bit, or just reflect personally in your own time why you misgendered that person. What you shouldn't do is be defensive. The conversation shouldn't be, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Hey, why aren't you accepting my apology? What's wrong with you? Why am I the one that has done something wrong? Simple as apologize and move on. In the example of the white friend, the conversation could have gone a little bit like this. Hi, I see that something's making you upset. The black friend recounts the story. The white friend says back her own version in her own words of what the black friend said to make sure she understands, and then can either say, that doesn't match my lived experience. Can you help me understand why that is racially insensitive in your view? This does something important. It validates the black friend and makes it known that she was heard, and then also is careful to not invalidate the lived experience of that black friend. In the first instance, what likely happened with the white friend is that she has an understanding that comes from her lived experience of what racism is. And what the black friend said seems to have invalidated her understanding of racism. So she felt the need to defend her own view of racism, which is where that line came from. Oh, you're being oversensitive. He didn't mean it that way. However, in this case, the black friend's lived experience is what she is talking about. She hasn't intentionally tried to invalidate the lived experience of the white friend. And in fact, the white friend likely has an somewhat incorrect lived experience. She hasn't personally dealt with racism in the same way on a day-to-day basis like the black friend has. However, there's still that emotional hit that comes from having something you believe invalidated. So when that happens, what's important is to recognize that your lived experience is being invalidated in some way. And you have to decide whether you're ready to either tackle that invalidation and perhaps grow into a new lived experience, or whether you'd rather just disengage. So if the white friend isn't ready to tackle this conversation, she should at least attempt to validate. So as I said, repeat what the black friend said back to her using her own words. Or she can say something along the lines of this. Hi, I understand that was a really difficult thing to go through. However, that doesn't really match up with my own lived experience. and I want to avoid invalidating your lived experience. It's not something I'm in the mental or psychological space right now to discuss, but I'll gladly help you find someone who you can discuss this with. In that instance, while there might be a little bit of a negative impact on the black friend, since the white friend doesn't want to talk about something that has just impacted them, it winds up causing much less harm than the white friend attempting to assert their own lived experience. And with that, let's move into a little bit more about why do all the black kids sit together in the cafeteria. And this is about identity development. Now, identity development can be seen in stages. Now, this is adapted from the racial, ethnic, and cultural identity development framework that's laid out in Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and a few other places. I've adapted these to be more applicable outside of just race and ethnicity. These are really meant to be rough identity stages that people go through for any type of identity. If you're interested in this type of content, I implore you to go seek out more information about it. It's really interesting stuff. So the stages start with being completely unaware. And then there is some form of inciting incident that makes someone become aware. Then people start to seek groups or communities. And then finally, they exit those communities and put in place guardrails. So let's start with that first stage, being unaware. This is usually a stage where someone hasn't even recognized that they have an identity that is different from everybody else. This might be someone who doesn't recognize that they're different based on their race or their gender. Now, usually there's some sort of inciting incident that propels someone into awareness. Now, this can happen at different stages within someone's life. When it comes to things like race, people usually become aware relatively young, whereas things with sexuality, people might not become aware until they're into their late adulthood. But this is a stage in of itself, becoming aware. Having that inciting incident, realizing that you're different in some way and that you're treated differently as a result. This stage usually comes with a lot of anger and a lot of confusion and overall just being upset about things. After a while, you'll tend to go and move to the next stage, which is seeking out a group of like-minded or similar individuals. You can either form a community or join a community that already exists. And this community usually feels quite protective. It feels like everybody just gets it. It's like the black kids table in the cafeteria that our young black student went and sat down at. And finally, usually after some time, an individual exits that community, not leaving it, but once again going out into the larger world and interacting with people that have differing identities on that domain. However, when people do this, they generally put up some guardrails around their interactions with people outside of their group to help protect themselves. These guardrails can be things like saying, I'm not going to discuss a specific topic with anyone outside the group, or it can be, I'm only going to discuss this topic with a select few individuals, or within a certain amount of time. So maybe I'll spend 2 hours per week talking with people about racism. Now, a few things I want to say about these stages. First, it's a lifelong process. Throughout your whole life, you're continually developing your identity. You'll encounter new ways and new identities you didn't know you had over time. Also, this is a bit cyclical. Each time you discover a new identity or a new portion of an identity, it'll feel familiar to the first time you discovered your first identity. However, it will be a little bit different. Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together at the Cafeteria explains it as a circular staircase, where over time you pass by things that seem familiar, yet they're different and you're in a different space. Also, these stages of identity development are bidirectional, meaning you can go through them and you can go up and you can go down. And also, you might never move out of a particular stage. You might always stay in the unaware stage where you don't even know that you're any different from anyone else. Or you might move into the becoming aware stage, but not be able to find a community, so you just stay aware that you're different. And I think what's more popular and more common is that you'll oscillate between that seeking group and being a member of a group and kind of going out of that group and setting up guardrails. Usually there's times when there's some sort of incident that occurs that kind of pushes you to wanting to be part of that core community again. In recent times, I know that myself and a lot of my black friends have kind of retreated back into really only talking about racism with our communities, because it can be emotionally and psychologically taxing to talk about it with people outside of our communities, especially when those places aren't psychologically safe environments. However, if you haven't gone through all of these stages or you haven't recognized these stages, it can be a little difficult to understand what these are. So I want to use an example that applies to essentially everyone watching this talk. And that is Gophers. Now, I'm going to go on a limb and say that most of the people attending GopherCon identify as a Go engineer, or someone interested in the Go programming language. However, not everyone understands that Go engineers are a bit different. Gophers are a little bit different from other software engineers. So a lot of you watching this talk might be completely unaware that Go is really that different from any other programming language, or that our community is different from any other programming language community. Many of us have gone through a stage where we had an inciting incident that made us aware. Perhaps it was that one friend who really loves programming languages like Java and C++, saying, Go's not a real programming language, it doesn't have generics. Or maybe it was that one Hacker News thread you were reading that basically said Go's a stupid language because it doesn't bring anything new to the table. Generally, it would be something that makes you stop and think, this is different. I feel different. I don't identify with the people on the outside. I identify with the people on the inside. Usually that'll lead to community seeking of some sort. With the Go community, it's rather easy, as it's mostly online and there's even in-person meetups you can go to. And usually you'll feel safe and comfortable discussing things that you might not want to discuss with people outside of Go. For example, I tend to talk a lot with Go engineers about how a lot of the times I haven't found a need for using generics. Anytime I've had a problem that could be resolved with generics, I found another way to solve the problem, and it's usually come away a bit cleaner. Now, for a long time, I didn't really talk with anybody outside of the Go community about this because they didn't really understand that. For them, it didn't make sense that you could program a lot of things without having to use generics. Now, this doesn't mean that I don't think that generics are valuable or useful. It's just that I haven't found a need or use for them, and I found a community within the Go community that feels similarly. And finally, after some time, I did become comfortable speaking with people outside of my community within the community about my views and thoughts on generics. I had the emotional and psychological bandwidth to go out and discuss with them and walk them through the process of why I feel like Go can be used for basically any purpose and doesn't need to have generics to do so. However, there are some things, for example, the meme of, you write if error does not equal nil, return error so much you need a key on your keyboard to type it out for you. When I hear that, it often stings a little bit, but I know when I talk to other Gophers that it's like, if you're writing that a lot, you're probably not doing error handling as well as you should be. That's a code smell. You probably need to shift your code around a bit. But I don't generally talk to people that aren't part of the Go community about that because it can be quite exhausting, because then you get into arguments about error handling and exceptions. And you know what? Most days I don't want to talk about that. So you can go through these stages for essentially any type of identity you can think of. I hope that these examples using Gophers and Go engineers has helped you understand how the same can be applied to race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, neurodiversity, what have you. And I do want to say that understanding the stages of identity development is core to improving your impact versus intent with people throughout the community. I've talked to a number of people who are often very confused at why 3 of their black friends give them 3 very different answers about what they feel about racism or how they think we can fix problems dealing with race. A lot of times when you're on the outside of an identity, it's difficult to understand why people that are in different stages of developing that identity think so differently. For instance, internalized racism is a real thing. And if you've grown up in a place or in a mind space where you think that racism isn't a real thing, then you as a black person or a Latinx person or an Asian person might interact with other groups and say, well, you know what, it's overblown. It's not really a problem anymore. Whereas someone who's had that inciting incident and has maybe done some research, talked to a few friends, and formed a community might say, yeah, of course racism is a thing. And they might have the same identity as the first person. Understanding that these 2 people are likely in different stages of identity development can really help in understanding why the conversations with them are so different. And this is also applicable to Go engineers, as I stated before. In general, I have found that people who really, really want generics have been writing Go for a couple of years. I haven't found many Gophers who have been writing Go for more than 4 or 5 years that really, really want generics or really, really need generics. So I often use that as a little bit of a marker to understand where someone is in kind of developing their Gopher identity. Now, that doesn't mean that people that think that we need generics are less than. And really, being at any stage within identity development isn't less than any other stage. Being unaware isn't less than becoming aware, isn't less than being in a group, isn't less than exiting and having guardrails. They're all just different stages. They're different, not on some hierarchy. And with that, I want to move into our 3rd block, continually being curious. And you can think of this as generalizing the first 2 building blocks into an abstraction we can use to build our own blocks. So let's talk about building better software, because that's what this is all about at the end of the day. I know that I have found some of the most difficult bugs to resolve, and then resolve them by being curious about the code I'm working on. Perhaps it's that time that I inherited a code base that I had no idea about, and most of my team didn't have an idea about. But I sat down late at night just working through the code because I wanted to understand it better, and a bug came by a couple days later that was related to that code I just read. That curiosity made me more prepared to resolve that bug. And just like that can be useful for solving bugs, it's useful for helping us interact with people within our community. Getting to know people better, understanding the stages of identity development, understanding intent versus impact, doing your own research, forming your own opinions, can make it easier to have positive conversations with people within the community. And it can also help you have conversations that help them grow as well. To solidify this a little bit more, I want to give another example. Now, in this example, we're on a mailing list of some sort, and someone posts, X is always red. And someone else responds with, no, you're wrong, X is always blue. Now, the intent of the initial poster, X is always red, was likely positive. They wanted to spread some information of some sort. And the intent of the second poster was likely positive as well. They just wanted to correct someone. However, the impact of this statement could be positive or negative. If X is always red was a loosely held opinion by someone, and this statement leads to a further discussion that helps that person grow, the impact could be positive. However, if X is always red is deeply linked to someone's lived experience and deeply linked to their career as a software engineer and what they've learned, then saying X is always blue could invalidate that lived experience. Now, it's hard to know whether or not you've invalidated someone's lived experience until after the fact. Usually people will tell you with either a nasty retort or some other way of effectively ending the conversation. Or, in some cases, doubling down and being aggressive. A way to ease this is to really add the extra stuff that we've removed from our argument to make it a little more concise. For example, we could rephrase, "No, you're wrong, X is always blue," to, "In my experience, X is always blue. Can you help me understand why X should always be red?" Or, in the second sentence, "Can you help me understand why in your experience, X is always red?" This helps to diffuse a situation that could be quite tense. And it also really shows the intent of the person who's posting, right? It shows that what you're trying to do is start a dialogue with someone to come to some sort of result. Your experience does not match theirs. Let's discuss it and let's talk about it. Now, obviously this can get a little exhausting if you have to preface every statement with, "in my opinion," or "in my experience." It will get quite wordy. And also, we've come to see that when you use things like "in my experience" or "I believe," it's a hedge, or maybe a way of saying something that you aren't fully sure of, when that might not be the case at all. So I have basically two schools of thought on this, and it's about to preface or not to preface. One school of thought is, yeah, we should probably be using "in my opinion" or "I believe" in most of the words we write. But my other school of thought is this. Almost everything that we say, except for those things that we explicitly mark as not being so, are in our opinion or in our view. When something is not in our opinion or not in our view, we usually say, to play devil's advocate, or "I don't believe this, but here's a thought experiment." So there isn't much we can possibly say that wouldn't be in our opinion or in our view. But I tend to land in the middle here. When we have discussions, it's usually good to point out at one particular point, "This is in my opinion," or "this is in my view." That can be at the beginning, that can be at the end. But that kind of sets the stage to really let the other person know that, hey, this could be wrong. Let's have a discussion here. When I have conversations, I like to think of it a little bit like this, and maybe this device will be helpful for you as well. See, I really like to be right. And the way I've come to think about it is this. If we're having a conversation and I'm right, great. But if we're having a conversation and you're right, also great. Because now I have found something where I am wrong, and I can take what you've said and the thing you're right about and adapt it for myself. And what this means is that I get to be right when I'm right, but I also get to be right when you're right, which makes me right more of the time, which is what I wanted. It's a simple mental trick, but it has helped me a lot in learning from others and being open to hearing other people's opinions and challenging my own views of the world. Also, over time, that helps you develop more solid and long-lasting views. If you continually try and prove your views wrong, prove what you think wrong, then you'll wind up in a place where a lot of the times you aren't wrong. But there's another important reason why we should communicate in this way, where we purposefully express that our views are in our opinion and our statements are in our opinion, in our experience. And that is to avoid accidental gaslighting. Now, gaslighting in general is a form of psychological manipulation where one person tries to convince another that something that the other person knows is true about the world is not. Real simple example, you're outside looking up at the sky is blue, and you say, "The sky is blue." And someone who is gaslighting you says, "No, it's not. What's wrong with you? The sky is red." That's gaslighting. Now, accidental gaslighting is a bit different. See, in gaslighting, someone is intentionally trying to convince you that you're crazy, in effect. With accidental gaslighting, that's usually not the intent. Most of the time, it's like from our first example of the school dance, what the young white student did to her black friend. It comes in the form of trying to assert your own lived experience when someone else has said something that has invalidated it. Now, in the example that we laid out, it's the "no, you're wrong, X is always blue" that has the potential to be accidental gaslighting. If X is always blue is a controversial or fringe statement that hasn't gained a lot of popularity yet, and X is always red is the community-driven consensus, to someone that's new and has just learned that X is always red and just wants to share it with people, you could be accidentally gaslighting someone by saying X is always blue. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have the discussion about it. It just means that we have to be careful in how we communicate. And a key way to do that is to always be curious. Because by being curious, it's essentially always asking the 5 whys. Whenever someone says something that doesn't align with what your lived experience is, it's an opportunity to ask them, why? Why do you believe that? Why do you have those views? And to respectfully do so, not in an antagonistic way. So, with that, let's wrap up what we've talked about today. First, diversity and inclusion can help us build better communities and better software. Next, we should focus on aligning our impact with our intent. And when it doesn't, we should apologize and avoid causing further negative impact. Next, we should understand that people are in various stages of identity development and that shapes their views and interactions with others. And finally, by staying continually curious, we can avoid accidentally invalidating and accidentally gaslighting others, and it really is the base component of building more diverse and inclusive communities. I want to thank you so much for watching, and have a great rest of your GopherCon.